Hi, welcome you all to the new video in international economics. We have already covered two topics in international economics. The first topic was the subject matter of international economics. It was followed by the importance of international economics. Today we have a new topic, internal trade and external trade. This is a simple topic, internal trade and external trade. You all know, I think, the meaning of internal trade and external trade. First of all, let's look at the meaning of internal trade and external trade. So internal trade is a trade within the nation. It is the domestic trade. It is the trade between regions or states in a nation. For example, the trade between Kerala and Tamil Nadu. We buy vegetables from Tamil Nadu. That is the domestic trade of Kerala with Tamil Nadu. And we buy cattle from Karnataka, Maharashtra. That is also domestic trade. So domestic trade is happening within the nation. It is happening between the states or provinces or regions. That is internal trade. And come to the external trade. Similar way, external trade is the trade between nations, the trade between India and China. We import so many commodities from China. That is our external trade. United States import so many commodities from India. That is the external trade. So trade between nations is external trade. Trade between states or regions or provinces in a country is called the internal trade. So what are the alternative terms for internal trade and external trade? These are actually pretty simple to understand. Internal trade is also called domestic trade. It is also called the interstate trade or inter-regional trade. It is also called the inter-provincial trade. So internal trade is the domestic trade. External trade is also called the international trade. So trade in the bigger sense means international trade. Trade theory refers to the international trade theory, and it is also called the foreign trade. These are the alternative terms for internal trade and external trade. Internal trade within the nation, external trade between nations. So let's classify internal and external trade on the basis of production and sales. So internal trade, in the case of internal trade, production and sales happening within the nation. For example, the commodities, vegetables are produced in Tamil Nadu, and it is sold in Kerala. This is internal trade. So the production and sales happening within the nation, within India, between states. This is internal trade. And for external trade, the production and sales happening between nations or it is happening in another country. For example, when India crude oil is the largest import item of India for many years. So we import crude oil immensely from the OPEC plus nations, including Russia. So the production of crude oil happening in the Middle East, in OPEC nations, in Russia, in other nations. So, but sales happening in another country, that means crude oil produced in OPEC nation sold in non-OPEC nations or non-oil exporting countries. This is external trade. So on the basis of demand for goods and services, the internal and external trade can be distinguished. So the demand for commodities, demand for goods and services for the internal trade is coming from the country, coming within the country. So demand for commodities in case of internal trade is coming from the country. For example, the demand for Tamil Nadu vegetables is coming from Kerala. That means production and demand is within the country. Supply and demand is coming in the same country, that is India. At the same time, for the external trade, the demand for commodities is coming from abroad or foreign nation. For example, demand for Indian textiles. India is well known for its textile industry. Coimbatore, our city of Tamil Nadu. It's a major city. It's a major city of Tamil Nadu. It is also called the Manchester of the South. Manchester is famous for the textile industry, and Coimbatore is also Tirupur are also famous for the textile industry in India. So the demand for commodities in the external trade, for the foreign trade, is coming from abroad. For example, the demand for textile in Indian textile is coming from United States, China, and many other countries. In similar way, the demand for crude oil is coming from other nations, non-oil exporting country, non-OPEC nation. This is the difference between internal and external trade on the basis of demand. Where does the demand originate? So on the basis of currency used for purchasing commodities in internal trade and external trade is different. For example, in case of internal trade, we know that Indian domestic currency is used. In India, it is Indian rupee. In United States, it is United States dollar. For example, when we purchase something from a shop, we use our own currency. We cannot use United States dollar. It is meaningless. It doesn't have any value in India for the domestic purchase, and for the external purchase, foreign currency or international currency is valuable. It is worth buying. For the external trade, foreign exchange is used. Domestic currency cannot be used in most cases. For example, for purchasing crude oil, we need to pay the import bill in United States dollar, euro, etc. Why we use United States dollar and euro? Because these currencies are international currencies. These are not just foreign currencies. These are international currency. International currency is used for the international payments. All foreign currencies are not international currencies, but all international currencies are foreign currencies for us. So this is the difference on the basis of currency usage for purchasing in internal and external trade instances. So on the basis of restriction, we can classify internal and external trade. For internal trade, for domestic trade, there are less restriction or mostly no restriction. There will be no restriction. There will be a few restrictions only for crossing the state borders. There is not much. There will not be much restriction for crossing the state borders. But for crossing the international borders, there are so many restrictions in place. For example, in case of importing commodities from foreign country, we need to pay importers have to pay import tax, exporters have to pay export tax. All these taxes will be reflected in price of the commodity. It will affect the consumers as they have to pay the price, since taxes will be calculated in cost of production, so it will be added to the price. That means in case of restriction, there are so many restrictions in place for external trade, but for internal trade there will be no restriction or less restriction. For example, when we buy vegetables from Tamil Nadu, we don't have to pay the import tax, we don't have to pay the export tax. The only tax is GST. This is applicable for all commodities produced and sold in India. So that is the case of restriction. That means there will not be much restriction. But in case of external trade, besides import tax and export tax, there are so many non-tariff barriers. There are so many legal restrictions. There are so many controls. For example, health standard. Health standard means the commodities have to fulfill the health quality requirements. Otherwise, the commodity may not be permitted to be imported. So this is the case of restriction. For external trade, so many restrictions are there, but for internal trade, there will not be much restriction. On the basis of transportation cost, internal trade and external trade can be classified. And for internal trade or domestic trade, there will be less transportation cost. Transportation cost, or the cost of bringing commodities from the origin to the destination, is less, as the distance is too low. That may be closer in terms of kilometers. There will not be much distance compared to external trade, and just a road journey or road transportation or rail transportation are the major modes of transportation in case of internal trade for all the nations, almost all the nations. But for external trade, this is not the case. Transportation cost will be higher since the distance is too high, and sea transportation is a major mode of transportation. In certain cases, air route is also used for bringing commodities like vegetables, fruits and medicines. So for these kinds of commodities that need to be transported quickly, air transport will be used. So transportation cost is too high for external trade compared to internal trade. So on the basis of factor mobility, internal and external trade can be classified. What is factors? Factors means mainly capital and labor, capital mobility and labor mobility. So in case of internal trade, factors are completely mobile. It is almost perfectly mobile, as there is no restrictions in place for mobilizing labor and capital. We know that in Kerala there are so many interstate migrants, and they are now on the way back home as COVID-19 induced lockdown in place, and the threat is still there. This is why they are here. It is because of free mobility of laborers between the states in India, as there is no restriction. No visa is required for coming from Rajasthan to Kerala and back. So this is there is no restriction for the for coming, for the mobilizing labor, and for capital mobility. The financial market, the banking system in Kerala and Rajasthan are same. That means capital is entirely perfectly mobile within the nation. But this is not the case for external trade. In case of external trade, factors are less mobile or immobile. For example, take the case of labor. So in order to work abroad, we need to get a work visa. We know that so many Keralites, Malayali diaspora are working abroad, especially in the Middle East. So that is international migration. But in order to go there for work, we need to get a visa from the respective countries. So that kind of restriction is not in place for internal trade. So with that, let me conclude the presentation on differences between internal trade and external trade. Internal trade is taking place within the country. External trade is taking place between the countries. Internal trade is also called domestic trade. External trade is also called the international trade. Factor mobility is perfect in internal trade. factor mobility is restricted in international trade. Transportation cost is less in internal trade. It is too high in external trade, and there will be no trade restriction for internal trade. There are so many trade restrictions for external trade, and domestic currency is used for internal trade. Foreign currency or mostly international currency is used for external trade. Demand for commodities in case of internal trade is coming from within the country, but for external trade it is coming from abroad. Production and sales happening in same country in case of internal trade, and it will be happening in different countries in external trade. So these are all about the differences between internal trade and external trade. And if you have any doubt on this topic, you can make your comments, you can ask questions in the WhatsApp group or in the comments section. Thank you.